I'm very pleased to introduce Daniel. He's one of our young MPs for the New Democrats. He was born and raised in Winnipeg's Transcona neighborhood. His father, many of us knew as Bill Blaikie. He was really one of the NDP legends who was an MP for 30 years, really, for the same riding, Elmwood Transcona, and its predecessor ridings. He retired in 2008. We lost the riding of Elmwood Transcona to the Cons in 2011, and Daniel took it back in 2015, and he increased his vote share by nearly 50% in 2021. So fabulous, performance, Daniel. He has a BA from the University of Winnipeg and an MA in philosophy from Concordia University. He's also certified as a construction electrician and a member of IBEW, so he's an active member of the union movement. He previously worked as a ministerial assistant in the Gary Dewar provincial government and presently sits on the federal finance committee. He's a critic for finance and for employment, workforce development, and democratic reform. I'm very proud of Daniel because he spoke out against the Liberal Party's failure to support legislation to protect workers in the event of a company's bankruptcy. Here in Saskatoon, we had a terrible disaster when Sears went under and people lost their pensions. It was just a terrible debacle. So thank you for your good work, and we look forward to hearing from you today.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'll just start by way of saying that I know you guys are on Treaty 6 territory. I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, the ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So that's the territories that I'm situated on today, and really honored to have been asked to come and have a chat with you all in the context of your annual general meeting. So thanks for thinking to invite me. I really appreciate it. And as I understand, I'm going to talk for a little bit about the supply and confidence agreement and how things have been unfolding in Ottawa over the last 12 months or so since that agreement was signed. And then we're just going to open it up to a little bit of Q&A, if that's all right with everybody. And I'm happy to take questions. And I think one of the occupational hazards of politics is that you get good at talking, but then you can talk and talk and talk. And the best way to make sure you're talking about things that people want to hear about is to keep it grounded in a question and answer conversation. So that's always my most favorite part. A couple of just things that I like to say at the beginning when talking about the supply and confidence agreement. The first thing is that I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone in this room. We're living a really difficult time when it comes to politics. Things got really nasty during the pandemic, and they were already on that trajectory before the pandemic. But people have a lot less patience with those who disagree. They're willing to be a lot more personal in their attacks, as opposed to trying to keep it about the issues at stake. And unfortunately, too, we've seen an increase in people's willingness to use violence to advance their political aims. So there are certainly MPs who have had their offices and their staff attacked or assaulted, and that's true of New Democrats. It's true of people from a number of different parties. Peter Fonseca, the chair of the Finance Committee, who's a Liberal, had his office set ablaze, actually. And so, we know the stories about, the Prime Minister and other ministers. All that to say, we are in a nasty time. It could be worse, but it has been better for most of my lifetime. And I think one of the things that the supply and confidence agreement was meant to accomplish, among others, was in this moment of really nasty politics, trying to show that even where we disagree with a political organization like the Liberal Party on so many important issues, that we can try to do politics differently by focusing on what we can agree on and trying to make some progress on those things, while still being honest about the fact that we don't agree on a lot of stuff and that those disagreements are meaningful. But if the choice is to entrench and retrench on the disagreement and increase the intensity of rhetoric in a time when that's already going too far in some cases, or to try and tone down some of the rhetoric and find more places of common agreement, that could be a model that's more important than any of the kind of particular items of the deal, but in another sense that it could be important for modeling how we can perhaps find a road to doing politics in a better way that acknowledges the fact that we have real disagreements, but still finds a way to do politics in the way that actually I think a lot of Canadians still expect their politicians to do politics, which is, yes, to disagree, but to go to Ottawa and try and find a path forward that's in the public interest in spite of our differences. So I think that's important to keep in mind about the agreement kind of at a meta level, if you will, even as we talk about some of the particulars in the agreement. And of course, for the most part, what the NDP end of the agreement is to simply not cause an election, provided that the government continues to make steady progress on the 27 items that are in the agreement. And if you Google supply and confidence agreement, you'll find a copy of the agreement published both, I think on the Liberal side, it was published out of the Prime Minister's office. On our side, it's on the party website. It details what those 27 areas are. And the timelines on those issues, where there are timelines, are also public and in that document as well. And so that's the other component, I think, to bear in mind, is that, our commitment was to keep this parliament going instead of having another election, provided we were making that progress. And the document is public. It's not it's not like there was some kind of secret deal cut or something like that. It's all of that is online, and the issues that we're making progress on are by and large the issues in the agreement. And of course, we disagree on a lot of things that fall outside the agreement. Although there are some examples of success outside the agreement, I'm happy to highlight those as well. So what is in the agreement and where have we been making progress? Well, the big thing, of course, is a dental program. So why is that a big deal? I think a lot of you already know that, oral health is an important part of good health overall, that actually, people do end up in our medical system. They end up in emergency rooms because of health problems that have started in their mouth because they couldn't get basic dental attention. And so I do think that it's important for people's quality of life, but it's also important from the point of view of a country with a public medical system that ends up paying a lot more on the back end for providing healthcare to folks when we don't do enough preventative care up front. And there are a lot of ways in which Canadian Medicare fails to invest appropriately in preventative medicine. But oral health certainly has been one of those areas forever. And we're on the road to addressing that in a really substantive and meaningful way. So that's, if anyone wondered, was this something the Liberals were going to do anyway? We know that they certainly wouldn't. In fact, just about 6 months before the last election, they had voted with the Conservatives against a motion that simply said dental care is a good idea. The country should adopt a dental care program. It wasn't binding. It was just kind of a statement of principle. And the Liberals weren't prepared to support even that. So we know that our influence has moved the needle considerably. I'm confident we're going to get that job done. And that in and of itself, as far as I'm concerned, was a good enough reason to keep this parliament going long enough to be able to deliver on something like that. But beyond that, we've made some advances on the question of housing. So the Canada Housing Benefit, that was a $500 payment to folks who were low income and whose rental costs exceeded 30%, I think was the threshold of their income. That was made available. That was something that was not on the docket, so to speak. When it comes to fossil fuel subsidies, the agreement talks about eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. We have seen the government eliminate some so far, not enough, frankly, and I do believe that there will be more to come on that file within the life of the agreement. And I won't pretend that even on agreement items, there is still disagreement in some cases about what exactly it means and how to do it. But that's part of the work that we do, not unlike a negotiating team. Of course, we're talking a lot about negotiation right now with folks at the PSAC going out and demanding respect on the picket line, and rightly so. We've been clear and always have been from the inception of the deal. Jagmeet was just reminding caucus that one of the things he said to the Prime Minister at the very beginning was that, first of all, that we wanted proportional representation, and that was a non-starter with the Liberals. But second of all, that under no circumstances were we prepared to support anything that smacked of back to work legislation or anything of the kind. And so that's certainly something that's been an understanding in the deal from go that continues to inform the way that this strike is rolling out, because that is not something that we would support. So on fossil fuel subsidies, there's been some work done. I think there's more to do, but that's important from the point of view of ensuring that our public dollars aren't going to driving emissions up further. We've done work around attaching, so some of the new tax credits that the Liberals have announced for investment in the new energy economy have what we call labor hooks, but it really just means that companies that want to avail themselves of the full benefit have to pay prevailing wages, calculated not just on prevailing union rates, but the prevailing union wage package, which includes pension contributions and benefits as well. And that's to make sure that companies aren't competing on these projects and for public dollars by undercutting workers, and that the competition takes place on their ability to deliver and, their ability to source goods rather than their ability to convince people to work for less. And we think that's important in its own right. We also think that it's important in terms of ensuring that workers are at the center of transitioning to a lower carbon economy. And that's what we mean when we say workers can't be left behind, among other things. And this is the first time that conditions like this have ever been attached to a big federal spend like this. So it is really groundbreaking in terms of getting it done. Another place where we've tried to center workers in the new energy economy has been around the growth fund. So that's a $15 billion fund that the Liberals announced to invest in clean electricity generation, transmission, distribution, and other kind of big projects like that. And we've secured a commitment from the government that there will not only be the usual suite of investors and business people and bankers and all the others that they like to put at those decision-making tables. There's going to be 2 seats for workers at that table as well. So that means, worker representatives who are getting information about those projects, who are able to advocate right at the table for the kinds of labor conditions that we want to see and the kinds of jobs that we want to see be part of those investments. I think that's really important. As a New Democrat in Ottawa, I've come to learn the importance of having the right people in the room and the right people around the table. And I see this as our work issuing and ensuring that long past this agreement, there will be worker voices at important decision-making tables around the climate transition, so that we don't have to take the word of banks and corporate investors that they're going to look out for our workers. Our workers actually get to sit at the table and evaluate those things up front, which I think is really important. In this budget, there was $4 billion more for urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing. So that's essentially off-reserve housing. Compared to the need, it's not a lot of money, but it is a lot more money. It's $4 billion more than would have been there. And I think what is both interesting and kind of exciting about this funding, which builds on $300 million in last year's budget that we were able to secure, is that instead of that money being run through national Indigenous organizations who often are very much rooted in the concerns of people at home within their own reserve. We know there's a large Indigenous population off reserve, and there's a lot of Indigenous-led organizations that serve them well in our municipalities, but who haven't always had the funding that they need in order to be able to do that. So there's a coalition of Indigenous groups that's been forming across the country. Laurie Idlout, who's our MP from Nunavut, and Jenny Kwan, who's our housing critic out of Vancouver, have been working with this group and at their meetings alongside government officials to try and make sure that the Indigenous-led organizations themselves are empowered to make decisions about that funding. Like a lot of things with the Liberal government, it's a rocky road and we've had to push, but our position in this Parliament has allowed us to be at that table and to do the pushing and to support Indigenous-led decision-making. So I think that's going to be a very interesting and exciting file to watch over the next 12 to 24 months in terms of how it develops and the results that they can get for people. It builds on $4 billion of distinctions-based funding for housing that we secured in last year's budget that does flow through national Indigenous organizations. So altogether, in the last 12 months, New Democrats have been responsible for getting another $8.3 billion committed for Indigenous housing from coast to coast to coast over the next 7 years, which is a good down payment on all of the work that needs to be done. Although the total need for Indigenous housing across the country has been assessed by some to be as much as $60 billion. So 8.3 pales in comparison to the level of need, but it's $8.3 billion more than would have been there if it hadn't have been for New Democrats asserting themselves in this parliament. I talked a little bit about some wins outside the deal. I think the most important win that we got outside the deal was a doubling of the GST rebate, something that, we hear a lot from the Conservatives about inflation, but they're very light on any ideas about how to actually mitigate the impact of inflation on folks. They do talk a lot about, scrapping the carbon tax as one way to do that. But of course, Pierre Poilievre has no problem when he's talking about government spending, outlining how that will contribute to inflation. Eliminating the carbon tax also means a huge amount of money back in the pockets of Canada's wealthiest Canadians who pay the most of the carbon tax, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and receive the least back. So, if government spending is inflationary and we can't do it, gifting a whole bunch of money back to Canada's richest folks through scrapping the carbon tax is also going to have inflationary pressure. Poilievre is very concerned to talk about one kind of inflationary pressure in the economy, but as soon as it has to do with rich people having more money to spend in the economy, he doesn't really want to talk about it. So I think it's important for us as New Democrats to remind people that a lot of the tax cuts that he's talking about, a lot of the tax cuts that Conservatives in Manitoba are doing right now, I know that's not in your backyard, but $800 million in tax cuts that predominantly are going to go back to the richest Manitobans. And I'm quite confident that in Saskatchewan, your government, which is very much of the same ideological ilk, is doing similar things that actually put a lot of money back in the pockets of the people that are most likely to spend that on inflationary spending, not just trying to keep up with their grocery bill. And so that's why the GST rebate was so important, because that money went back to people that really are just going to spend that money on the increased cost of the things they were already buying. There's no extra room in their budget for them to contribute to inflation if they wanted to. They're just trying to tread water. And doubling the GST rebate was a really important way to do that. That was recognized by many private sector economists as not an inflationary spending. And so interestingly, you've actually seen legislation for the doubling of the GST rebate pass through Parliament very quickly with unanimous consent. And it's not because the Tories like it, it's because they know they don't have any ground to stand on in opposing it. And so that has been a way that we've not only been able to devise good public policy to help people, as I would say we did with dental care. Tories find ways to argue against that. We also managed to find a path through the political noise to make sure that help could get delivered in an expeditious way for people who really need it right now. And I'm proud of that. I think that was a real accomplishment on our part to be able to come up with a policy and box the Tories out of finding a way to oppose it. So unlike their carbon tax scrapping, which would be far more inflationary than the GST rebate doubling. And so I think that was an important accomplishment. I also want to talk a little bit about many things that are outside the deal that we are frustrated about. And you will hear, if you've been watching the NDP caucus in the House of Commons, you will see us criticizing the government. We have not shied away from that. We're not going to shy away from that. We have been on their heels on everything from employment insurance reform. And we're hearing from all corners that there is going to be a recession in Canada of some kind. It's not to scare everyone in the way that Poilievre likes to run around hyping up fear and anxiety, but the economy is not going to grow a ton, and it is probably going to technically get into the area of recession. Why? Well, because the Bank of Canada, frankly, is trying to cause a recession. They want economic growth to slow down. I had the governor of Bank of Canada committee last Tuesday and got him to admit that he's actually trying to increase the unemployment rate, which is, I think, dumb and not helpful. I think we're being poorly served by a right-wing ideology that's baked into the very infrastructure of the Bank of Canada. Incidentally, that's not what Pierre Poilievre is criticizing, right? But that's the thing that's actually coming for Canadians. Why is it that the governor of the Bank of Canada, in a time of generational change in the labor market, when labor shortages that we've known for decades are coming home to roost, is saying that he's going to deliberately increase the unemployment rate through higher interest rates? and we're going to have a recession because of it, because that's something he's committed to do for employers that are concerned about having to pay too much for the labor of qualified people. We should be willing to pay people what they're worth. And companies are still going to have to, because in a lot of the industries where labor tightness is really acute, it's because there's a lot of skills that aren't readily available. And employers are going to continue to have to compete for the folks with those skills. In fact, the way to ease that labor tightness is not by raising interest rates. It's by having the federal government invest in training programs to make it easier for people to say, you know what, I may be in my mid-30s, but my industry isn't, my career isn't working out the way I thought it would. My industry isn't, post-pandemic, or now with climate change, or whatever the industry I was in doesn't have the future I thought it did 15 years ago. And I need some time with a little bit of income support to be able to go and recalibrate my skills and recalibrate my education to be useful to employers in another industry. What does the Bank of Canada say? If the government spends too much, we're going to raise interest rates. If the unemployment rate is too low, we're going to raise interest rates. Actually, what we need is government spending to support people through education and training to be able to meet labor market demands. That's what we need. So the Bank of Canada is saying that if the government spends on training, for instance, it's going to consider raising interest rates again, is really quite unhelpful. Not just unhelpful to workers, although certainly also unhelpful to workers. I would go further, make the case that it's unhelpful to employers, the very people the Bank of Canada is so concerned to help. And it's because they have ideological blinders on, and they think they can just starve people into being good at working in industry X, Y, or Z. They're wrong. We need to support people in acquiring the education and training that they need. So that's all part of the employment insurance package. What would a good employment insurance program look like? It would look like one that provides income support to folks that have been laid off. And it would also be a program that provides education and training to them to be able to change industries if that's what makes the most sense for them while they're out there looking for work and as part of their new job search. That's the kind of employment insurance program we need. The Liberals are totally missing in action. They said in 2015 they were going to modernize the employment insurance system, and they haven't done it. Since then, we had a global pandemic. We had to scrap the EI program, invent a complete new one, and administer that for 2 years, and then they canceled it without providing a replacement. So we're right back at the Harper era employment insurance regime that obtained before the Liberals were ever elected. That doesn't make a lot of sense, and yet that's where we find ourselves. That's something we've been very openly critical of the government on. In fact, in response to Chrystia Freeland's speech on the budget, that was the issue that I chose to center in on, and they still don't have a good answer. When it comes to housing, we push them to do some good things, but their approach is still largely broken because they're not willing to invest enough in non-market housing and building up that non-market housing base, but they're also not willing to act against financialization in the housing market and the investment activity that's been happening. Because I put to you that Liberals, like Conservatives, still fundamentally see housing as a commodity instead of as a public good and something that people should have a right to based on the fact that they're human beings. And we can't be human beings in a good way without shelter and without a home. And so if we could actually transition our housing policy to put people at the center of it instead of putting investment at the center of it, we would be far better off, and we would have a stronger economy. Because one of the big things that employers are complaining about right now is that even when they find someone with the talent that's willing to accept the wage they're prepared to pay, people can't come to their community and have a place to live. And so it's a non-starter for them because they don't have a home. So, I'm part of, I think, the way of thinking that I've been trying to develop as a New Democrat in Parliament is to say, actually, like investment activity and the entrepreneurial economy that Conservatives and Liberals love to talk about can only succeed if you have a large base of infrastructure, physical and social infrastructure, that enables all of that activity. And I think we've come to a point where they've forgotten about that. They think you can commodify everything. And the fact is you can't. The investment economy, a capitalist economy, actually has to take a lot of public infrastructure for granted in order to be a successful money-making enterprise and not end up like a private dictatorship with people like Elon Musk calling the shots because they own the satellite infrastructure, or they own access to the internet, or they own all sorts of things that are important. So if we want to keep power democratic, we have to find ways of having that public infrastructure available and having a place for the market that isn't everything. We need to identify the things that people need and that go into a successful economy and that we end up paying for anyway as the public, and find a way for us to get to own a piece of that as the public. And that can be through government. And, you know, people in Saskatchewan are no strangers to that. We've got Manitoba Hydro here and Manitoba Public Insurance, good examples of public ownership, but it can also be cooperative ownership. You know, the credit union movement is a good example of this. The consumer co-op, housing co-ops are good examples of this. Collective bargaining is a good example of how we give people economic power in ways that don't involve government ownership. So those are some of the things that we've been talking about. Anyway, I was saying on EI and on housing, these are places where I think the government is really failing, and I think there are reasons why they're failing and ways in which they're of a feather with the Conservatives. We continue to make that case. Pharmacare, of course, is another one. Now that's in the deal. I think there were a lot of people that were surprised not to see it in the budget. I wasn't, as the finance critic, because I knew that the commitment for this year is to get framework legislation in place. And so it wasn't meant to be something to get stood up this year for, like, from a funding point of view, but that work is ongoing. And now that a lot of the main legwork on dental is done, although there's still important work that has to happen to stay on the timeline, but a lot of the conceptual work has been done. Our health critic, Don Davies, is turning his attention in conversations with Minister Duclos to pharmacare and what that framework legislation will look like by the end of the year. So I hope that gives you a little bit of I don't want to talk too much more, but I hope that gives you a kind of broad sense of, you know, at a high level, what is the agreement really about, and what is it really? What does it say about politics and a way of doing politics that I think is positive? Talked a bit about some of the wins that we've been able to get for people already under this framework in about 12 months, which I think is a decent list, and we're working hard to make that better. But we're also very aware of all the places where we do not agree with the Liberal Party of Canada. We never have, we never will, because we have fundamentally different values. And we are working to articulate those differences, and we are going to bring those differences to the electorate in the next election to say, here's proof of what we can get done for you when we have power in Ottawa. And here are all the things we'd like to do that we can't get done with the Liberals because they don't believe in it. And that is the opportunity of an NDP government, is to not only get the things that we were able to get working with the Liberals where they would agree, but to get all of these things for Canadians in addition. And I think right now we are proving that we are capable of doing that work. We're capable of getting results. And we want to go to Canadians and say, allow us to do more by electing more New Democrats in places like Saskatoon University, of course, where we're very hopeful that we'll be able to have somebody sitting around the NDP caucus table from in the next Parliament, a larger caucus doing more things for people. So with that, I'll wrap up and open it to questions. Thanks.
Before you do, Daniel, thank you. And I'll say more in thanks to you shortly. But in terms of questions, we have several people, I think, who are only on phone. And so, well, I'm going to give them the opportunity, anybody on phone, to ask a question first. And in the meantime, anybody else who would care to ask a question, I'd ask that you go to the bottom of your screen and raise your hand. And we'll call on you after we at least see if there's anybody on phone who would like to ask a question first. So having said that, do we have any participants on phone who would like to ask a question of Daniel? And if so, please speak up and identify yourself.
There is no one left on the call on phone. It was just Joseph was the only one.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Then I'm going to go to Barb Sebastian for our first question. Barb?
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Daniel, for your talk, and it's really interesting. My question is just wondering what the NDP view is, or thoughts going forward about the possibility of some 40,000 immigrants coming to Canada to fill workers' positions. There's been a lot said about them coming, but I'm wondering, how does the country, how do you think the country should handle that? And where are they all going to live? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I think this is certainly something that we've been raising as a problem. We've said, you know, we understand that we want to be welcoming as a country, and that economically it makes sense to be bringing more people to Canada, but we have to be able to support people when they come. And that is why the government has to get a lot more serious and a lot more ambitious about housing policy. And they have to invest substantially more than they have been, because if it's going to work, if we're going to bring folks in order to fill the positions in the economy that we're hearing need to be filled, then folks have to have a place to live, and that's only going to happen if we're creating. I mean, I think, you know, there are, for as much as the Conservatives say we need municipalities to issue more building permits more quickly, I don't know what the case is in Saskatchewan. I can tell you there's whole neighborhoods going up overnight in Winnipeg. There's no lack of development permits in Winnipeg, but it only builds one kind of housing, and it builds housing at a certain price. And so for all the folks that can't afford that, and it's not a real thing for, we're not, you know, developers are at capacity. It's not like they got a whole bunch of folks that are available to build more houses that they're not already building. Human resources are more of an issue for developers than permitting, from what I can tell. And so we need to be developing all the other kinds of housing along the spectrum that we need, including, in some cases, you know, better assisted living options for seniors that are living in a home that's bigger than they would like to maintain right now. But if you can't figure out an affordable alternative that meets you where you're at in your time of life, then you end up staying in a house that otherwise could be on the market, right? And we want people to live in places that meet their needs. So we need to do a lot more thinking along the whole housing spectrum and be willing to invest in it, or we're going to be bringing a lot of people here that are going to be bidding up the cost of housing, making it hard on folks that are already here, but also not living up to the promise that we're making when we invite people to come here and we tell them there are jobs and a place to live, just for them to find out that we won't recognize their credentials. So, you know, they might be a doctor where they come from and they think their earning capacity is going to be one thing. We say, no, you can't practice as a doctor. You'd be lucky to get a job as a cab driver. And by the way, there's nowhere for you to live. Well, that's not what I want Canada to be doing on the world stage, giving folks a false impression of the life they're going to have when they come to Canada. And there's a lot of policy work that needs to happen. As I say, in the housing space, I think that's one of the biggest ones in terms of problems, but also around credential recognition and making sure that folks are able to use their talent and experience to the maximum possible impact when they arrive.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barb.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to try and send out a list on chat, but Vita Landon, you were, I believe that you were next. So
I think it was Robert Clipperton, actually. So Robert, go ahead.
Thanks, Vita. I appreciate that. Daniel, I'm just terribly pleased to hear you today. It is so refreshing to hear somebody with ideas, with shows that what a record of accomplishment we can have even when we're in opposition, that I'm not left wondering how we are different from the other parties, because you're willing to stand up and say what we believe in, and not only with concrete ideas, but also those ideas are based on our philosophy and our party principles. So that was great to hear. I think your comments on housing in Winnipeg pretty well mirror what's happening in Saskatoon. And just a comment on the immigrant piece. I'm part of a refugee sponsorship group, and our family came in early February. Still, the services for immigrants are so overtaxed in Saskatoon We thought, okay, we'll get some medical attention, within a week, and we'll have language classes starting within 2 or 3. Well, I get to drive the 2 guys to their first medical appointment next week, and the language classes, they're on waiting list, and we don't think those are going to show up for months.
Right.
And you kind of wonder if by the time they start their language classes, the year of support they get will be gone, and they won't have any choice but to be in the labor force. So there certainly is a need for more resources there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Vita, Landon, then Ariana, and I think Kathy Sproul will be on deck. Okay.
Hello, all. I'm Vita Scarson. I have a question about housing policy specifically. There was a Twitter post by Jagmeet recently, and I think it was either taken down or something happened. Twitter has been a whole can of worms
a hot mess
in general. Yeah, but my question is, what is the housing policy and what particular problems it is addressing? I checked the website for ndp.ca and I couldn't find it. So maybe that is something that the central party could add.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to speak to some of the things that I've been talking about with Jenny Kwan, who's our housing critic, and including some things that we've announced at press conferences and talked about in the House, but that I think you're right in saying haven't been kind of codified on the website or in a platform document yet. So first of all, we've talked about, we do just think there's no getting around the fact that we need a lot more public investment in building public housing. Now, in Manitoba, we've had a Conservative government that's been trying to divest of public housing and kind of sell off Manitoba housing units. I think that's wrong. And I think Manitoba Housing here anyway has done a good job traditionally being a steward of a lot of public housing. I would like to see them expand their inventory, not reduce it. And I think that federal funding should play a role in that. But we're not committed just to government-owned housing. So we want to see more money made available to nonprofits and to co-ops to be able to expand the number of units or create new co-ops or whatever the fit is for wherever it is in the country. We need a program that's flexible enough to be able to hear those needs and then allow people on the ground to meet those needs. So I'll just start by saying that the other things I'm going to talk about aren't instead of that level investment. And as I've said, people say, where are you going to get the money from? How can you afford to do this? The fact is that one of a real limiting, constraining factor on our economy right now is the lack of availability of housing. For people on the right who want to talk about economic growth, they're fools if they think we're going to have meaningful economic growth without a lot more housing available. And so that, I would say, with respect to folks that I disagree with politically on many things and ideologically with many things, that by their own lights, they have to come around to the view that we need to invest a lot more in housing because it is a precondition of the kind of economic growth that they want to see. If they can't figure that out, then they're not anywhere near as smart as they say they are when it comes to the economy. But the other things we need to do is to limit the investment activity inside the residential housing space. So there's a few things that we should be trying. In New Zealand, one of the things that they did was to say that if you, say, I think it was like 10% down you needed to put up for your first single detached dwelling. If you wanted to buy another one, then you'd have to put down 20% and then 30 and then 40. So they had an escalating down payment amount tied to the number of homes that you own. So that's one way to try and discourage what we've seen by a lot of folks, and they're not all like evil corporate investors. Some of them are just, you got like an electrician and a nurse couple that own a home and they said, we want passive revenue. How do we do that? Well, why don't we buy another home? We've paid off half our home so we can tap the equity to buy another one. Then they've got 2 homes, and after a while, and interest rates were going down. So then with the same amount of equity, they could suddenly leverage more credit to buy more homes. And we saw an explosion of this kind of activity. I don't begrudge small households that were looking ways of finding passive income, but I think as public policymakers, we have a responsibility to look at the impact of that in the residential housing market. And the impact of that has been to drive prices way up. And that's a problem, because now there are people that don't have their first home, that are despairing of ever being able to own a home, who are competing with those smaller operators that might own 4 or 5 properties, but also some large corporate players that are doing that on an even bigger level that's hard to fathom. And so escalating down payments is a way of trying to moderate that activity a little bit without closing the door on people being able to get maybe a second or third property to have a little bit of passive income. But it's a way of trying to cool down that investor activity. Another way of trying to cool down investor activity when it comes to rental units is to say that that we want to have a system where if there's a building with apartment suites that currently are affordable, that there's a way, if they're going to put up for sale, for people to know that it's coming up for sale, so that you don't just have a corporate investor who's connected to the right people, who hears that a building is coming up for sale and gets to swoop in because they have a bunch of cash on hand already and buy it before anyone even knew that it was going to come up. We want nonprofits to be able to know and to be able to plan and to maybe make a bid on that. So there's a couple of things that come into that equation. One is the notice. Second is having a pot of cash on hand where nonprofits with demonstrated experience running affordable or social housing can tap into it relatively quickly to acquire a building. What we're hearing right now from a guy by the name of Steve Pomeroy, who's a housing policy expert in Canada. He says that for every 1 unit of affordable or social housing that we build in Canada today, we're losing 15. So when you think about that and what it takes to address the housing crisis, we're not standing still, we're losing ground. We continue to lose ground. So when we lose buildings that have a bunch of affordable units, we got to build that much more in order to just be in the same place, never mind make progress. So we need better mechanisms to make sure that we can maintain affordable and social housing instead of losing it. And the nonprofit acquisition fund is one of those ideas that we think could work well. We just saw the BC NDP government introduce a modest nonprofit acquisition fund there. We've encouraged the federal government to partner with BC to double the size of the pot and to make that available to other provinces that would be willing to sign on, so that we can, and that's a strategy to try and maintain more affordable housing, but also try and, dull the edge that big corporate investors have right now. Because even if everyone knew at the same time when an affordable building was coming on the market, the fact is a lot of these big corporate investors they're already sitting on the cash. Whereas a nonprofit has to apply to maybe 2 or 3 or 4 different pots of government money, and it takes a year or 2 for them to find out even if they're going to get the grant, and it doesn't happen fast enough for them to be able to compete. So we want to create a structure where it's easier for those nonprofits to be able to compete for existing infrastructure to keep it affordable. So those are just a couple of the things that we've been talking about. Jenny and I throw a lot of ideas back and forth, and what we want to add to the debate are meaningful ways of curtailing that investment activity, not in a way that's, as I say, punitive to the couple that's got a little extra cash and trying to figure out how to plan for retirement with some passive income, but if you're now managing 9 or 10 or a dozen properties, that's getting to be of a size that we think folks don't need for their retirement, and it's really making it hard for other people to get a family home. And we don't want that investment activity and retirement planning to overshadow the importance of people being able to get a family home.
Thanks, Daniel. I know there's a lot in what you said, and indeed maybe some follow-up for that if we have time. But Ariana, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, you're next if you'd like to ask the question of Daniel.
Okay, yeah. Daniel, I appreciate what you did for the speech. Oh, well, I have a question. I wonder, what's your opinion on Bill C-11?
I think Bill C-11 and the campaign against it specifically is hyperbolic. I think that actually what's at the core of C-11 is trying to promote Canadian content in Canadian feeds. I don't think it's fundamentally about censorship. Censorship is what you take away. I don't think it's about taking anything away. I think it's about adding some Canadian content to Canadian feeds. And I would say that for me, this is part of a theme around Pierre Poilievre, ignoring the very real gatekeeping powers of private wealthy actors in the economy and just focusing on government. It's not that government can't be a problem. It's not that we shouldn't be concerned about government overreach. Those are real issues, and we should take them seriously. And I would say that I believe as New Democrats, we are vigilant about that. We're not resting on our laurels or not taking that seriously. But C-11, the other thing that C-11 does is it actually would require these giant web platforms to pay tax in Canada and to pay into a Canadian content fund in the way that large broadcasters already do. That's a positive. Those guys walk away with tons of money that they raise in Canada that if they were a business operating at the local main drag, they would be paying a lot more in tax than they do on the revenue that they get. I think we should be finding a way to make web giants pay their fair share. C-11 is part of that. And it's also about promoting Canadian content. Now, the other thing to note, and I actually had a debate with Poilievre on the floor of the House not that long ago. I think we put that together on my YouTube channel. So if you're interested in following up and watching that debate, you can. The fact is that social media companies already decide what Canadians see with an algorithm. So, the campaign against C-11, I think, pretends that somehow there aren't already powerful interests deciding what Canadians see. They already do. Social media companies do that according to an algorithm. Pierre Poilievre called it an online meritocracy, as if Facebook and Google don't take their own interest into account when determining what people see in their feed. I mean, give me a break. Give me a break, they don't. They've shown they're very sophisticated operators. They lobby governments the world over to create regulatory frameworks that are in their interest and don't jeopardize their profit. Do we really think that they're blind to all of those things when they're designing algorithms too? Give me a break. And we saw guys like Elon Musk, who own Twitter, which is one of these very companies, after having some apparently nice meetings with the Russians, decide he was maybe going to take away the Starlink internet capability of the Ukrainian military. I mean, there's a guy that's acting in his own self-interest. This is the guy that Pierre Poilievre loves to buddy around with and appeal to. He just did it by getting Elon Musk to say that the CBC, for all its many faults, and it's not a perfect organization, is a government-funded organization, as if it was like Chinese state communism or something, which is obviously false. So for me, the C-11 campaign is built on a fundamentally naive principle, which is somehow that if democratically elected governments aren't regulating anything to do with social media space, that somehow we're all going to be well served by this neutral online meritocracy designed by billionaires. I don't believe that's true. And I'm not offended by the idea that a democratically elected government would make some decisions like, we want to promote more Canadian content in Canadians' feeds so that they get an opportunity to see Canadian artists. And that when that's happening, social media companies then benefiting from Canadians viewing that content by selling ads and stuff like that, pay a reasonable amount of tax back into a fund that helps generate more Canadian content. So I'm not convinced by the arguments against C-11. I think it's actually a decent bill. And I don't think the sky is going to fall. Conservatives said that the sky would fall on a number of pieces of legislation that have passed. The sky didn't fall. I don't think it's going to fall with this one. What I do think is the case is Canadians are going to be a little bit more familiar with Canadian artists and Canadian content creators. And web giants are going to be paying some tax on the benefit that they get from the promotion of that content.
Thanks, Daniel. We're going to go to Kathy Sproul, who is planting the seed for an EDA in Belize as we talk.
There you go.
So go ahead, please, Kathy.
Yeah, it's beautiful here today, but I'm really glad to be with all of you. And Daniel, thank you so much to you and the caucus for the amazing work. I know you guys are working really hard. And I sort of think the role of the MP is threefold. First and foremost, maybe most importantly, is the critic work that you do in opposition. Secondly, would be your constituents and your riding work. But the third piece, and that's where my question is focused, is on the party and the health of our party. I've recently engaged more in the federal party. I was involved in the provincial party for almost 20 years, and I've just kind of switched over. And as I am finding out about the health of our party, I hear a lot of concerns, and one is obviously around the rebate, which I'm sure you've heard and discussed many times. And obviously lack of funds, shortage of staff. And but what I am concerned about is the democratic health of our party, and particularly the resolutions process, which, if I understand, is probably as flawed as the provincial process that we currently have. And, you know, every NDP member has great policy ideas. We all know that. But what I guess my question would be is within your caucus, what sort of concerns are being raised about the democratic health of our party? We have a policy committee that is not functioning currently. Our federal council doesn't seem to be able to do the work that it is prescripted to do. And you know, maybe my question is, where do you see the caucus fitting in, and do you have discussions about how to make that better?
Well, I'll start by saying, and I don't mean this in any kind of dismissive or diminutive sense, but I will say, like, for as long as I've been involved in the party, there's always ideas about how we should be doing it better. And I've yet to be at a convention where I think everyone was satisfied that the process was good. But I do think we have an obligation to try and do these things better. I think that internal party democracy matters a lot, and that it's, you know, not only just from a historical perspective, but I think from our values perspective too. This isn't just about the way things used to be. It's about the way we want them to be, and the way we want to democratize decision making. So I do care about those things. I think resources are a real challenge. Like, if there's one thing, and we've seen this play out in a different way on Parliament Hill, where, you know, parliamentarians are supposed to have all the resources they need to hold meetings, to talk about issues, and not just to do that in one language, but to do that in both official languages. And we have suffered since the pandemic on that score, because the injury rate among interpreters is very high, with sound quality issues, you know, bad internet connections, all that kind of stuff. And it's inhibiting our ability to do our job sometimes as parliamentarians. Why do I say that? Because we're far better resourced as parliamentarians than we are as members of the New Democratic Party. And we're struggling even there. And one of the things, you know, that the federal party has to contend with, that most provincial parties don't to the same extent, is the challenge of space. We're trying to make democratic decisions across one of the largest areas in the world, and language, because as a federal party, we have to be able to do that in both official languages. And then there are questions of accessibility for people living with disabilities, and, you know, and a number of really legitimate things that we have to address. And we're trying to do that on a shoestring budget, which is part of where the rebate conversation comes in too. I mean, even just to get the loans for the bank, the bank wants something that they believe they can rely on in terms of money coming in. And so EDA signing over that rebate has been a lot for the party's borrowing power at election time. I'm glad for the fact that we've found a way to make that work, even as I also would love to be able to get the full rebate amount that we used to get here at Elmwood Transcona, and add that to our coffers, you know. So I certainly understand why people are upset about that. I don't think that's unreasonable, but I think it's been really hard on the party office to figure out how to resource a national campaign in the circumstances we find ourselves in. One of the really brilliant things that happened under Jack Layton's leadership that he led was buying a building in downtown Ottawa to be our party headquarters and to provide collateral for election loans. That's been an important part of our financing, but we have been at times close to losing that building. And so the rebate action was part of trying to ensure that we were able to keep that asset and continue to use it. And we were in a tight spot. Part of that was because, you know, the Tories got rid of the per vote subsidy, well, Tom Mulcair was leader, and I'm not sure that our internal practices changed quickly enough to recognize that dearth of revenue. And we were in a pretty bad spot going into the 2019 election. So it seems to me that the financial position of the party has been improving. And I think part of that is a testament to Jagmeet's effectiveness as a fundraiser and the priority that he has been willing to put on, like the kind of personal emphasis that he's put on party fundraising as a leader. But we're only just starting to turn that corner. I think there's more work to do, and a potential election. You know, I mean, I don't think it's going to happen this year, but you know, I don't know if we're going to make it to the fall of 2025. We shall see. These things are outside our control sometimes, but that's not a lot of time to get ready for another election and the cost that's going to entail. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of where I'm at. I do think we could do more work on internal party democracy. I would like to see that, but we need to be able to fund those forums for us to even talk about what that process looks like. And we don't have a lot of staff and resources to be able to do that right now. So I don't pretend to have all the answers, although I agree that that's an important area we should be making some progress in. But even right now, I know like we've moved the convention from Winnipeg in July to Hamilton in the fall, and you know, the folks that do work for the party are going to be really preoccupied with trying to make that convention a success between then and now, and it doesn't leave a lot of extra time and resources to be able to develop better internal processes. I think that's part of our challenge.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask to move on here. Sam, and then Doug, and then Tony. And so let's go with you, Sam, and ask you to, you know, more or less get your questions concise for Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. I don't know if it's a question, just an information for your sake. Last week, you know, Jagmeet was in Saskatoon on the 13th of April. As he was leaving the following day, I met with him and extended an invitation for him to come to Saskatoon on June the 17th. I was speaking to him on behalf of the Hindu Society to be our guest speaker at that event on June 17th. And I'm asking you to mark your calendar, but I don't have firm confirmation that he's going to be coming to Saskatoon. By the end of next week, I will know that. And if and when I know that he's going to be the guest speaker, I'll be sending you information about the banquet. There'll be about 800 people at that event. It'll be good of you and Jagmeet to be present in Saskatoon, just to scare the crap out of the SAS party guys.
Right on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. Doug?
Yeah, thank you very much. Daniel, thank you very much for your speech. I've heard you before at the USJE convention in Winnipeg some time ago. So thank you very much for all this. And as obviously as a PSAC member, I'd like to thank you and the NDP for standing behind us and making sure that we don't get, well, as much as we can, back to work legislation, because we know that that seldomly works. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the work that you and the PSAC are doing. And as I've been trying to remind people over the last few days, particularly those who are want to complain about, you know, public service workers and this and that, I say, like, listen, everyone is hurting from inflation. And we know that public service contracts set the bar for what's possible in the private sector. It's rare that people get private sector increases over and above what public sector workers make. And so I see your strike as a really important moment, not just for public sector workers, but for people across the economy who want to see wage increases that are commensurate with inflation to protect their purchasing power and to protect their quality of life. And I think you guys are doing a great service to folks in Canada by not being willing to settle for less. So thanks for that work. It's my pleasure to support it, and I hope you guys get a fair deal soon.
Thanks, Daniel. Tony Bassett.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much for giving your time and having some very thoughtful words, the work that you're doing. I just want to say an aside, my work related, I'm in Manitoba quite frequently, and it's interesting to see the dynamics that are happening in that province and the similarities and the differences between Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And I think New Democrats, both at the provincial and the federal levels, are well positioned in that province, especially with the provincial election coming up there shortly. So it's a very interesting province right now, politically speaking. I wanted to ask one question with regards to the coalition between the party and the Liberals, and as far as policy concerned. And I think you've highlighted a couple of things that are that you can mark as achievements. One being, of course, the dental program and pharmacare, which as you indicated, is a work in progress. But there's one thing that always struck me as curious, and why it hasn't been higher on the agenda as far as the party's concerned, and that's, we talk about the democratic reforms, and that's why the party, at least at the federal level, hasn't taken advantage of the political dynamics and situation right now to push forward the democratic reforms as so far as how we elect our representatives to Parliament. One of the things that the Prime Minister has talked about is using possibly using a system of proportional representation to better reflect the vote cast by Canadians in federal elections. Of course, we use the first past the post system, which tends to be disadvantageous to smaller parties as far as representation is concerned. And I'm wondering why the party has not seized on the opportunity to really push the Liberal government to enact democratic reforms, perhaps including changing the system from first past the post to proportional representation.
Well, thank you very much for that question. It's a question that that's pertinent for me because I am the party's democratic reform critic. It's also on a personal level important to me because, you know, moving to a system of proportional representation is one of the things that motivated me to run for office in the first place. And in fact, I'm going to be on a panel tomorrow, a fair vote panel, with a Green MP and a Liberal MP discussing voting reform. That's being hosted by Fair Vote. And I understand that people feel that the NDP must not have been putting this forward. Like, I hear that. And I appreciate opportunities to let people know it's not true, in that we have raised this. It was one of the first things that we raised in negotiations around the CASA. Both Jagmeet and Ann McGrath were reminding us, the caucus, of this as recently as Wednesday. The Prime Minister said a lot of things about voting reform in 2015, and he didn't mean them. And then we got a committee. Actually, that was one of my first accomplishments as an MP, was to pitch the concept of a proportional membership committee. That was the Special Committee on Electoral Reform. And we got that even in a Liberal majority context because they screwed up the file so bad and their proposal was so bad that they needed somewhere to go. And we kind of walked in and said, well, why wouldn't you do it like this? It turns out the Liberals agreed to that model because they thought the opposition parties would never find a path forward, but we did. We said that the kind of recommendation of that committee was to have a referendum on a mixed member proportional system, and everybody put some water in their wine. Referendum's not where I think we should go. It's not party policy, but it was a way to get Conservatives on board with a recommendation that provided a path forward, instead of letting the Liberals off the hook by being able to say, oh, well, the committee didn't have any real recommendations. And the Liberals took that committee report and they threw it in the bin. And the Prime Minister has said very clearly, including last fall, if I'm not mistaken, he was interviewed, I think he was in a Latin American country at the time, and he was being asked questions about democracy, and voting reform came up, and he said very clearly he's not willing to entertain any proposal for proportional representation. He says it creates divisiveness and inaction, and he's wrong, but that's his view. And he is very deeply personally committed to that view, and many members of the Liberal cabinet are committed to that view, and it is a hard no from them. So it's not that we haven't put it forward. It's not that we don't want to go down that road. We would like very much to go down that road. I think one of the most meaningful structural changes that this supply and confidence agreement could have made would have been around voting system reform. But I think the Canadian public continues to underestimate the extent to which Liberals want the status quo and are working very hard to defend it. And that's not something that we as New Democrats can change, except by replacing them, which is what we seek to do at election time. And I recommend to everyone, and I'll be doing this at the Fair Vote meeting tomorrow, that if you're serious about voting reform, the best way to do that is to replace Liberals and Conservatives with New Democrats. That's how we're going to get the job done. I wish there was a path that didn't require that as a precondition for voting reform, but I'm more convinced than ever that we won't see meaningful voting reform in this country as long as the Liberals are in government.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a very important comment for us to keep in mind. I see no more hands up. Now, I know that we could probably go around again and there would be a whole bunch of supplementals, but I'm also conscious that we've had you for an hour now, and that you have been so gracious with your time, and your responses, your presentation and your responses have been terrific. We have recorded this, and I hope that you have no issues with us using that recording, perhaps to use some clips for our members in the upcoming communications we have with our membership.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you do that.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Really glad to have the opportunity to spend some time with New Democrats and to get to answer some questions and get the word out about what we are doing in Ottawa. I think, it's common for the right wing these days to complain a lot about mainstream media, but the fact of the matter is that democratic socialists in Canada remain those who are actually the most mistreated, ignored, or abused by mainstream media. I think we have the most to gripe about. We don't have our whole alternate news media of Fox and Rebel and all those other so-and-sos. So we're very aware of those problems of mainstream media, and it's nice to be able to just be in a room, however virtual, with other New Democrats from across the country and get to talk about the work we're doing and all the things that we want to accomplish together. So thank you very much for taking time out of your meeting. I know you have other business too, which you want to attend to, but I certainly appreciate your willingness to spend so much time engaging with me on these things today.
Well, thank you again, Daniel. I would just point out to our members that we've been very fortunate in Saskatoon University to have Daniel with us today. Previously, we've had Jenny Kwan on housing, and we've had Leah Kazan on universal basic income. So we have been very fortunate to have had some great speakers from our NDP caucus, and it much appreciated. And we wish you all well, Daniel, and thank you again for taking the time today.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your meeting. Bye-bye.